They shall be pure of heart and strong of body, untainted by doubt and unsullied by self-aggrandizement. They will be bright stars in the firmament of battle, angels of death, whose shining wings bring swift annihilation to the enemies of man. So it shall be, for 1,000 times 1,000 years, unto the very end of eternity and the extinction of mortal flesh.
Hi there, my name's Guy, you're watching Midwinter Minis, and in this video we're going to be painting up some retro-tastic 90s Ultramarines with a twist. The boys in blue are considered by most people who are familiar with the world of Warhammer 40k as the default Space Marines, and that's a pretty fair description. In the lore, the chapter's founder, Rabut Guilliman, literally wrote the book on how to be a Space Marine, the Codex Astartes, and all the other chapters use this as a template for their own army, some more strictly than others. They are ardent defenders of humanity, valorous and virtuous, sure, but the problem with being the default option is that it's a little bit boring. And I kind of always thought that choosing Ultramarines as your army when you have all of the other cool chapters to choose from sort of feels like seeing 1,000 ice cream flavours and choosing vanilla. And not only that, I've already painted Ultramarines. Twice. My speed painting video is just about to tick over 1 million views, and I even painted a 90s model in my Citadel paint unboxing video, and that's got a fair few views too. So, realistically, I don't really need to do this episode. Bye for now. Had you going for a second, huh? Seriously though, I want to give myself a proper challenge and not keep making the same video over and over again. Squidma. I'm a total sucker for the vibrant, precise heavy metal paint jobs from the late 80s and early 90s. That really hits me hard in the old nostalgia beans. There's a lot of amazing contemporary painters who really take the style to the next level, integrating modern techniques to create incredible, flawless retro minis. I can paint models, sure, but I think I maybe lack the skill and finesse, and probably the patience to paint something that looks this good. I make videos about what I do, sure, but I'm just a regular hobbyist. I don't paint every day, and I certainly don't paint to a competition level. But that's not going to stop me trying right now. I got chatting with my favourite insanely talented retro painter, Will, aka Goblin Green 2021, asking for advice on how to achieve his standard of painting. And, you know, one thing led to another, and before I knew it, he'd rocked up at Midwinter Minis HQ to give me a masterclass. And he had a few tricks up his sleeve.
Hi everyone, Will here. Now, I think you're being a bit modest here, Guy. I've watched you paint, and now I've seen your models in the flesh, so I know you're a fantastic painter with a steady hand and a keen eye for details, especially for someone painting on video. I do think there's a few bits of gear though that are really going to help you out on this project. Firstly, I've got you a Winsor & Newton size 1 brush. This is the Ferrari of paintbrushes, and it's going to help you a ton with those crispy lines and fine details. You can paint the entire model with it too, so it's going to be a really great help. Next up, and I know you're going to hate me for this, I think it's time to ditch the cut palette and get yourself a nice new wet palette. It's going to give you much more consistent paint, especially in this hot summer weather, and help you achieve that silky smooth paint finish that you're really going to be after on this project. And I know you love using those old 90s paints, but as they aren't the easiest for everyone to get hold of now, let's use modern paints instead. Now, the recipes for these paints is what's really important, but we can show those during the video. The only other change that I'd recommend on your setup is to use a magnifier. I use one all the time, and unless you're born with bionic eyes, like the heavy metal team, a magnifier is going to really help you with your brush control, your detail work, and for me, just being able to see the model properly.
This is going to get me seriously outside of my comfort zone, but that's what we're here for. I was absolutely gobsmacked by Will's ability and the results he achieved in just the few hours we had together, painting up the torso of the missile launcher marine from my set. I took careful notes of all his methods and the paints he used and readied myself for the challenge. One thing we did have to change though is instead of using the magnifier, which looks amazing to look through with your own eyes, but is almost impossible to practically film through at the same time with a camera, and that's how you're going to see what I do, and you're the most important person here. Instead, I hooked up my camera to a monitor just off screen, so now I have an even greater level of magnification to reference when I'm painting these super fine details. Will also left me one of his painted models to use as a guide. Jesus, setting the bar pretty high there, my friend.
Alright, Guy, now it's your turn, mate. Looking forward to seeing what you come up with. Best of luck.
Okay, here we go. Now, I may have already painted Ultramarines before, but I've never painted this particular sculpt on the channel. This is the Space Marine Sergeant from the 2nd edition starter set. A total icon. Grizzled face, wildly impractical power pack with massive banner pole stuck on it, a sword with chainsaw teeth, and a pistol the size of a small child. Welcome to Warhammer 40k. So after the usual steps of careful trimming and mold line removal, I drilled out some invisible parts on the pistol arm and power pack and mounted all 3 pieces to some plastic cups using paperclip metal and a tiny dot of superglue. In terms of priming, Will recommends giving the models an all-over coat of black, and then a slightly less thorough coat of white. It's not really a zenithal prime, the model is still mostly white, it just has a tiny bit of black in the darkest, deepest creases. The first step is to base coat all the areas of blue armour with Calador Sky, but because this style is all about edge highlights, it's really important to make the base coat colour as even as possible. To achieve this, we applied not 1, not 2, but 3 very thin layers of Calador Sky. In fact, some areas even got a 4th coat. I'm avoiding all the areas that won't be blue as best I can, but we'll fix them up with some more white undercoating before we paint the other colours. The next stage is the first broad recess shade using a mix of Calador Sky and Cantor Blue. This is the kind of thing that I would usually just totally skip because it's almost invisible after you've done it, but the subtle darkening bordering all the recesses will frame the tighter, darker shading we'll do next really nicely. Also, as I've still got the regular Calador Sky on my palette, I can instantly clean up any areas I was a bit too wide with my shading. The next layer of shading is done by mixing 2 parts of Cantor Blue with 1 part Doom Bull Brown. Rather than adding black to blue, which just desaturates it, adding something on the opposite side of the colour spectrum makes it darker but keeps the colour quite rich. A nice technique. This time, it's crucial to be as careful as you can when recess shading here. Hardly any paint on your brush, the tip twisted to a nice fine point on the palette, and slow, controlled motions. And again, cleaning up any areas I thought were a bit too wide with Calador Sky again. Time for the first highlight. A 50-50 mix of Calador Sky and the slightly lighter Calgar Blue, carefully edge highlighting all of the armour panels, edges and ridges. Because the edges on these old models are considerably softer and less sharp than modern Warhammer models, you often can't totally rely on running the edge of your brush along stuff. You often have to paint the lines manually with very careful brush strokes. Thankfully for this layer, I can be a bit wider than the next few steps. Unfortunately, it also means I have to outline literally everything, including every tiny vent hole on the power pack. The next layer is a slightly tighter highlight with just Calgar Blue, trying my best to make the lines fine enough so that you can still see some of the first highlight too. With that painstaking work out the way, it's time to move on to highlight layer 3, this time using Fenrisian Grey, and being as fine and precise as I could, highlighting just the top-facing edges and most prominent outward-facing edges. I know I always tell people to breathe normally when painting, but I have to admit I was holding my breath for nearly every brushstroke here. The penultimate step for the blue armour is a tiny edge and sharp point dot highlight to give a slightly glinting, ultra sharp look to the pointiest bits on the armour. And once that was out the way, I went back to the original base coat colour, Calador Sky, and refined the edges of the edge highlights, making sure things were looking as pristine as possible. Now if you've watched anything on my channel before, you'll know this is absolutely not the way I usually do things. I would usually base coat every colour, then shade every colour, and then highlight things. But Will's method is basically to choose a section, choose a colour, make it perfect, and then move on. The theory being that you're being so careful and methodical you simply won't make mistakes on other areas. Time will tell if I can manage that. FYI, yeah, the blue looks pretty nice, but it took me a full working day to do. Full-time painting for blue armour on one model. This is going to take a while. And now I'm challenging myself straight away here by painting the under armour. A pretty simple palette of Vallejo German Grey, Citadel Mechanica Standard Grey, and AK Interactive White to get the job done. Starting with German grey, being very careful not to hit any of the blue armour edges I've just spent so long on. I also painted the grenade, as well as any sections that will be gunmetal coloured later while I had the German grey out. I also painted the handle of the holstered pistol at his side. I've never noticed that before. He's got a bolt pistol in his hand and he has another one holstered. This mad lad is dual wielding pistols. The banner pole is getting a coat of German grey too, as well as the pipework on the power pack. The edges and ridges of all these areas, no matter how tiny and insignificant, were highlighted with Mechanicus standard grey, and then a tiny dot highlight of 50-50 grey mixed with white. Now before moving on, as I said I would, I cleaned up the areas that will be other colours like red, yellow and the face with thinned white paint, and this will help keep the vibrancy of the paint and make it easier to get a nice solid colour. I need to paint the metallic elements next, as if I wait it'll make painting the red bolter casing a bit of a challenge. Here's the triad I'll be using: Iron Warriors as the base coat, highlighting with Iron Hands Steel, and a final careful point highlight with Iron Breaker. Now, a lot of these steps are very similar, and I don't want to keep saying the same things over and over again. I just base coated all the parts I'd undercoated with German grey, and then slowly but surely moving up the highlight stages. Always being careful not to touch any other parts of the model by mistake, and also trying my best to leave a fine recess of German grey visible around the borders of the metallic parts. And I did think Iron Warriors would be dark enough for the recesses, but I don't think it was quite as dark as I imagined it would be, so I used a bit of thinned Nuln Oil just to line the edges and recesses of the metallic parts, just to add a bit of depth. Okie doke, time to bite the bolter bullet and try to paint this yellow trim. Aerial yellow is the way to go for the base coat. Again, keeping it thin and doing multiple layers to build up a nice solid foundation. I painted the top of the banner pole, the wings of the emblem on the chest armour, and very carefully the trim on each pauldron. Once that was nice and bold, I reinforced and saturated the yellows with Cassandora yellow, a pretty generous coat, and then when that was dry, I moved on to shading the yellow recesses using Scrag brown. Being very, very careful here, as aerial yellow is quite transparent and mistakes will be very tough to cover up. Every little nook and cranny got a gentle stroke with the tip of the brush, every feather, every ridge. This is way more effort than I'd usually put into simple details like this. I'd usually just let a wash of Agrax Earthshade do the heavy lifting. Once that was done, I moved on to the first highlight layer, Flash Gits Yellow, adding highlights towards the tips of the feathers, but making sure to leave some of that regular aerial yellow showing, as well as all the nice recess shading I just did. I also used this paint to reinforce and build up a vibrant yellow on the face of the pauldron trim. It's quite subtle, but here you can see what a difference it makes. The wing on the left has been highlighted, but the wing on the right hasn't been yet. Now, to really get serious with highlights, I moved on to AK Interactive Ice Yellow. I built my confidence by handling the relatively easy stuff like the raised details on the banner pole and the feather tips on the chest emblem before taking on the biggest challenge yet, edge highlighting not just the outside of the pauldron trim, but the inner edge too. Very, very careful, controlled downward strokes. Turning the model to get the best angle rather than trying to change brush direction is key here to keep things controlled. And when that trial by fire was finally over, a quick but very careful dot highlight on all of the sharpest edges using AK White, and the yellow stage is finally over. By this point I've been painting for 3 straight days now, so easily 24 hours on this model already, but we've got a way still to go. And by the way, this video is sponsored by Midwinter Minis. We just started a pre-order for a limited run of t-shirts and hoodies with that awesome 90s style logo you saw at the start of the video. Obviously heavily inspired by the classic Warhammer 40k logo, but legally distinct, we checked. Go follow the link in the video description if you want one yourself. Now, Will didn't leave me with any guides on how to paint the leather pouches, but I asked Hattie to use her very useful non-colourblind eyes to pick me out a nice rich base coat, shade and a couple of highlight colours to match the vibrancy of the era. So we've got XV88 for the base coat, Doomball Brown for the recesses, Zandri Dust for the wide highlight, and Ice Yellow again for the fine highlight. Similar steps again, remembering to keep the base coats thin and plentiful for a nice solid finish, and always being super careful to avoid any other areas I've painted. Even though, as I said, this isn't Will's recipe, I hope he likes the final result and maybe gives me some bonus points for improvising. I wasn't exactly sure how to paint the grenades, so I had a quick leaf through the old 2nd edition codices and found that more often than not, the grenades are a really deep green, kind of like the Dark Angel's armor I painted in the previous episode of this series. So I used a similar color mix of Caliban green for the base coats, trying to leave a little bit of that German grey in the recesses as best I could, then highlighting with War Flesh, and finishing it off with some fine detail work along the edges with Strachan green. I have to say, point highlighting each edge of the grenade's many tiny sections was a real pain in the bum, but it looks pretty decent once it's done. I ran into a similar problem with the skull in the centre of the chest emblem. I mean, sure, I could have just painted it yellow, but it's bone coloured on most of the painting examples in the codex and even on the front cover. So I made up a fittingly rich but contrasty palette of Xandri dust, Doombril brown, and then highlighting with a little bit of ice yellow and eventually white mixed into that Xandri dust. It's kind of a pity this model has a skull and not a gem like the others, as Will has an amazing method of doing them, but I'm sure he'll show you that on his channel soon, don't worry. Right, back to Will's secret recipes. Let's get this red painted. Crazily, we're going for Evil Sun Scarlet for the base coat. So vibrant. Go big or go home, huh? Anyway, as before, multiple thin coats to make sure it's nice and solid, and then it's time for a Midwinter Minis first, using a Citadel contrast paint. Blood Angels Red. I mean, ignore the unofficial looking pot, it's one of Hattie's secret pre-release testers, very cheeky. Treating this like a wide shade layer, I carefully panel lined all of the recesses and made sure any bordering areas were also subtly darkened by this too. For the proper fine recess shade, a mix of Incubi Darkness and Corn Red creates a really rich reddy purple, which when thinned nicely creates a fantastic shadow colour while keeping things nice and saturated. For the first highlight, Wild Rider Red. And for the second highlight, Fire Dragon Bright, but only on the top facing sections and the most pointy bits. And finally, a tiny point highlight using a little bit of thinned Luganeth Orange. Not my finest work. Time to tidy this all up with Evil Sun Scarlet again, straightening up the lines where the highlights were too wide and reinforcing the base coats again. Yeah, I mean, it's looking okay. This is honestly now a full working week of effort right here, and all I'm seeing is the mistakes. And I'm also not really used to working with the consistency of contrast paints, and I accidentally stained the teeth of the chainsword, so I had to go back to the metallic steps and fix them all up. And I mean, I thought I was done, but Hattie could see loads of places where the red was still on the teeth that I just couldn't see because of my red-green colour blindness, so she fixed them up for me. What a hero. Right then, time for the skin. Keeping with the retro vibe, whether it was the artist's choice or the paint range at the time, but white skin models often looked pretty warm. Not so much sun-kissed, but jaundiced. So I chose a few paints that leaned more towards the toasty side. Kislev Flesh, Flayed One Flesh, and shading with Scrag Brown, and set to work. And I actually used a very thin mix of Scrag Brown and Reichland Flesh Shade to give the face some warmth and make a start with the dark recesses, and then took it over with just Scrag Brown to make some of them a little bit sharper and more intentional, doing my best to follow the old shade and highlight placement guide from one of the classic Mike McVeigh painting guides from back in the day. This guy's eyes are all scrunched up into a fine line, a real warrior's grimace, so there's no point trying to pick out whites or pupils, it would just look stupid. I dark-lined the eye slits and also darkened down the inside of the mouth with a little bit of thinned Nuln oil. Right then, time to build up the highlights by mixing Flayed One Flesh bit by bit, sketching on some wrinkles and trying to draw attention to the brow, nose and cheekbones. This is the first bit in the model that seems a bit less regimented, rather than being all armour and sharp edges, and I had a little bit more fun with it. For hair colour, I wanted to match the guy on the cover of the Codex, so Silver Fox it is. I base coated with Dawnstone, slightly warmer than the Mechanicus standard grey I used elsewhere. To get some quick shading done, I used a bit of thinned Nuln oil and then did the same again, but basically doing a precise recess shade around his hairline. For the highlights I used Corax White mixed with the Dawnstone and gave it some final streaks with very thin AK White mixed with Dawnstone. Also, let's not forget about the eyebrows. I always do and they always look a bit weird. Same palette as their hair, and just way more careful. Even though I tried my best, I still made them a little bit too bushy, so I had to cut back in and fix my mistakes with my flesh colours afterwards. Right then, time for transfers. This Dark Imperium transfer sheet has loads of unused Ultramarine stuff on it, so let's cut out a chapter symbol, a tactical squad symbol, and a little skull for funsies. Instead of water, I glazed each area that the transfers would stick to with microset, which should hopefully help them stick to the surface a bit better. I've covered using microsol and microset in other videos, but I basically did the same as I usually do, wiggling them into place, letting them dry, and then pressing them with a cotton bud damp with microsol to make them flatten to the awkward pauldron shape. It takes a few passes, letting them dry each time, otherwise they might break apart, but eventually I got them nice and flat with no kinks. In between waiting for those stages to dry, I painted up a quick 25mm base topped with sand, aka the best way to do wargaming bases. Now, I know I'm supposed to be using only modern paints here, and Warboss Green is pretty close to the old Goblin Green, but I might have to do a final base rim with Goblin Green just so it matches with the rest of my 2nd edition stuff. A quick tip for making the yellow dry brushing more vibrant: go in with a more opaque off-white first, and that way the more transparent yellow paint will catch the lighter areas, making it pop a little bit more. Time to assemble! I carefully pulled the pieces from their mounts, base coated any areas that you might catch a glimpse of if you were being sneaky, and then glued the model together. I marked the points where the wires poked out the bottom of the feet onto the base with some paint, and then drilled out holes so I could mount them directly on the base. Okay, almost there. One of Will's best tricks is to give your model a very light airbrush coat of this stuff, Galleria Matte Varnish. It helps make the finish a bit more uniform and less shiny, essentially to make it photograph a bit better. Very clever stuff. Right then, last step. Now, what good is this sergeant if he doesn't have a banner? I didn't have one of the original stickers, so I jumped on my computer, found a reference pic, and recreated the classic banner in Affinity Photo. FYI, the font that they used was Times New Roman, proving that Ultramarines truly are the most basic of bitches. Probably a stupidly roundabout way of doing this, but I printed the banner out, 14mm wide, 20mm tall, cut out a back section for the banner and painted it with Evil Sun Scarlet in very thin layers, and then stuck the two halves together with Mod Podge. I edge highlighted the DIY paper banner with Uriel Yellow and stuck it on the banner pole with a couple of dots of Mod Podge on the contact points. And we are done! This is easily the longest I've ever spent on a single model, almost 50 hours in fact. What do you think? And also, what does Will think? He hasn't seen this yet, and I'm just about to show him the glamour shots.
Look at that, mate. Absolutely fantastic. Watching you paint with that fancy new brush guy, you look like a duck in water. I mean, just look at the wings on that chest. I know those plastic models really don't hold that much detail, but you wouldn't know from this paint job. The highlights on that grenade too are just perfect. I'd have loved to see some chevrons on that chainsword, but you know what? It looks like you had plenty of fun with the red on that already. What I'd love to know though is how you got the hole on the barrel so perfect. Maybe it's time you do a tutorial for me. Anyway, I think as a student in this video, you've been a 10 out of 10. I only hope I manage the same for my first try at being the teacher.
Oh man, I'm actually blushing. That was way too kind, Will. As I said, all the things I'm seeing are the mistakes and things I would change given another go, but man, you were a fantastic teacher, Will. I still can't believe you said 10 out of 10 though, but you said it now, no take backsies. Let's take a look at Will's model and my model side by side. Yeah, I mean, not bad. I'm quite proud of myself, to be honest. I still don't think it's on the same level, but it's certainly many levels higher than my usual best effort work. I'm so thankful for Will for his time and skill, teaching me his methods and helping me with my setup. As much of an incredible journey of painting discovery this was, I have to say it was pretty hard going. There were so many times I felt like giving up and just doing something else. And I think that even though this has maybe proven that I can paint to a pretty high standard for this style, it's definitely not something I would choose to do for fun. Proving a point, sure. Challenging myself, sure. But as a hobby activity, I don't think so. However, I can see myself using some of these techniques that I had to learn for this video, so ultimately I probably have grown as a painter and, dare I say it, as an artist. Also, look at all these paints I used, just for one model. Bonkers. Keep in mind that I only used 14 paints for my whole Blackstone Fortress series, which had over 40 different models. The 2nd edition shelf in my cabinet is really shaping up now too. Take a look while I thank the channel's latest awesome supporters on Patreon. Targlory, HAC, Kaflor, Peter Steelbeard, Ryan Spann, David Wilmot, The Supportive Chow Yong 117, Not Urquhart, Sherlock, Claire, Queen of Shebus, William Proctor, Archelios, Joe Crawford, Rich M, Alexander Phillips, Jake Landon, Garth Cronin, Matthias Van Uwenizer, Daki T, Sander Summit, Peter J, Owen Tourlemagne, Tom Lapp, James Calixto, and Exxon. It's the support of fans just like you who help us do what we do on the channel, and we really, really appreciate it. And hang on a second though, I hear you cry. Don't you usually paint up a whole squad for these videos, not just one model? Yes, I do, but it wouldn't have been practical for me to do all of them, and as I said, I've already shown you how to paint both new and retro Ultramarines, so I asked my mate Simon to paint the others for me following my retro guide, and didn't he do a fantastic job? You can still spot the insanely awesome torso that Will painted in our masterclass though. Crazy. Also, that was Simon doing the Reboot Guilliman quote at the start of the video. Just FYI, what a talented bugger. And before you go, head over to Goblin Green's Instagram and follow him, and subscribe to his brand new channel here on YouTube as well. Don't forget to grab your retro t-shirt or hoodie from the link in the description, and I'll catch you next time. Bye for now.